Welcome back to another episode of Télévision Éducative. Tonight, I'll show you how dreams are prepared. People think it's a very simple and easy process, but it's a bit more complicated than that.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to Breaking the Screen Spell, an Only in San Jose special that investigates and analyzes the impact of digital addiction and its prominence in society. My name is Deitra Hoang, and I will be co-hosting with producer Ellina Yin.
Okay. So, Deitra, this conversation, how would you summarize this conversation?
I would say we talked a lot about generational differences when we were using technology, and we also dove more specifically into Instagram and their idea of followers to following ratio, and how that might affect people on a personal level and change their self-perception.
Yeah, the generational differences, I can definitely see that in the conversation, and even just, what was your first social media account?
Instagram.
Instagram. And do you remember how young you were?
I was in 7th or 8th grade.
7th or 8th grade. That's young. 13?
Oh, really?
13, 14?
Yeah.
Well, I guess from my generational perspective, it seems young.
Okay.
I am not that old, but my first social media account, I believe, was MySpace, and it was a web-based thingy. Do you know about MySpace?
I've heard of it before.
So ancient, right? But just generationally, I'm trying to remember what we did on there, and it's very similar to Facebook. It eventually got replaced in terms of people ended up just using Facebook more, but it's kind of the same concept. And Facebook, now has become the place where my parents hang out. So my parents, who are in their mid-60s, love Facebook, and they're always posting and commenting. Basically, they're using it the same way I used to use it a really long time ago. So I think that's interesting. And now I'm more on Instagram, and then, you are showing me the TikTok ways, and it is entertaining.
Really?
Yes. So actually, you shared a really good clip of the talking to a Gen Z worker. So, yeah. So I really enjoyed that clip that you shared. And I want to share it in this episode. And for those of you who cannot see, basically it's like this older, maybe like Gen X. No, this person could be a boomer. I'm not sure. But they are older than you. And they're trying to talk to Gen Z. And so this is that conversation. Okay, then I'm just going to play it.
Okay.
So how have the vibes been lately? Low key? Off. Go off, King. I just feel like life's been mad cringe lately. Like instead of taking W's, I'm taking L's. And how's your Riz? Mid. No cap? On God. It's giving depression. Dead ass? Dead ass. Facts. That's facts. No printer. Period.
Okay, so I have so many questions. Let me start at the beginning. So first, no cap means no limits or no lies?
No lies.
No lies. Oh, I was misinformed. I was talking to somebody else and they're like, it means no lies. And I was like, no. I was told it means no limits, but I'm getting confirmation from a Gen Zer that is no lies. Okay. And then what is fax?
Can you give the context?
Well, when it said in there, like he was saying something, he's like, yeah, fax. And then
Oh,
he said,
that's like confirmation that it's true.
okay. That I can, okay. That's pretty reasonable. Okay, what is no printer?
Oh, that's like a play on words where he's like fax, and then he's like no printer, as in faxing the printer.
Oh.
I don't think that was used very often because that was my first time hearing of it too.
No printers. But he was crying and handing him a handkerchief, and so I didn't understand. No printers? Are you printing your tears? What's happening? Okay. So yeah. So I played it for one of my friends whom is a younger millennial than me. They are in their early 20s, and we were both laughing at it, and they were just like scratching their head, and we were trying to decipher the words. And I told them that I was like, I'm going to check with the source of truth here, and I'll get back to you. So I'm really excited for folks to hear this conversation, and hopefully they'll take some good tidbits away that will further their journey towards a healthier relationship with their technology. What else would you like to add? Anything else?
Yeah, looking back on our conversation, I was connecting it with today's sort of digital issues and how the upcoming generation of youths, Gen Alpha, is, for the lack of a better word, a test run of how technology truly impacts children and adolescents. Because this generation is the first to really get that experience of growing up with technology. As toddlers, they're given iPads, and as children and adolescents, when they're growing up, this evolves into smartphones and other devices. And sometimes it gets to the point where the child and the device are basically inseparable. And I wanted to point out that although the gap between Gen Z and Gen Alpha isn't that large, the majority of Gen Z was given portable and accessible tech during our adolescence. So we were more able to develop our fine motor abilities, linguistic skills, and develop learning habits. But with Gen Alpha, we can really start to see how technology can affect cognitive development. And this isn't based on research. I'm saying this like all as a sort of observation, because there are middle school teachers who post photos of spelling tests and the students they teach who are in 8th grade. And they're spelling in a way that is years below what they should be. And if we're trying to look for the root causes, I'm thinking that media and technology would be up there as one of the prime reasons. And I'm talking a lot right now. So I wanted to ask if you had any thoughts about this, or if you also think kind of the same thing.
Oh, absolutely. And I love that you brought that up. I definitely have a few Gen Alphas in my life now, and their ages between like 2.5 to, I would say, like 9 years old. And I don't feel like the 9-year-old had as much device time because of the age, but I definitely see in the 2.5 and the 3-year-olds, some of them have a much more, I guess you can say, intimate in terms of how intertwined it is in their life and like their regular rhythm. It's very common that I see when the parent is trying to do something and the child is not cooperating, that they would hand the child a device that distracts them. And the adults we know that what we're doing, we need that distraction, but I'm not saying it as like a shame on you kind of thing. I'm saying it's like, I understand that you need to get from point A to B, or like, maybe you have twins in the car and there's like more children or whatnot. There's a variety of reasons, but it has become a shortcut to get that peace and quiet to be able to do what you need to do in that moment, which would, maybe take the child in for like a vaccine shot or, whatever. And then I've noticed my friends, 3-year-old as well, but their parents intentionally don't give them the device. And I notice my conversations with the children who do have the devices that they expect me to be more engaging in their play. And we're always like doing stuff. There's like always something new and curious. And they do switch between different types of playings. Like I'll play puzzles with them or we'll throw around a ball. But things are very high energy and they switch between things versus the one child that's around 3 or 4 in my life. Our playtime is really slow. Like I'll read one story and then I'll ask them, oh, what did you think of that? And they'll pause or like, I thought this, what did you think of that? And we have more of a back and forth dialogue that I find even strange to be talking so consciously with a 3-year-old, but like it's a real dialogue about our favorite colors and our favorite books. And I find it really enjoyable. But I think noticed on the kids that have more time with devices that there's certain things, like one of them is very visual and really likes puzzles and is able to like put puzzles together really fast. And so they really like that visual aspect. And so those are the differences that I've noticed. And I think not speaking from a research level, but a personal observation like yourself is when you don't have devices and constant input of whatever it is, games, colors, visual, sound, that you're left more in a zone of using your imagination or getting bored and having to think of something to entertain yourself versus having entertainment constantly handed to you and like really investigating something versus getting bored and moving on to the next thing. That was like a long-winded answer, but that was definitely what your question triggered in me. I don't know if you have young children or, Gen Alpha in your life and if you observed anything.
No, that was a great answer. That was really interesting. But I don't have any Gen Alpha in my life. Or at least I don't think so.
That is definitely something that I noticed. And so that's even like another generation that, like you said, they're being shaped and they really are like this test pilot, and it's kind of scary. But at the same time, because we're doing this podcast, because you have come up with this, thought exercise and conversation that we are now immersed in week 3, week 4, week 3, I have hope. I have a hope that we are not going to just leave Gen Alpha in the dust with the tech.
Yeah.
We're looking out. We're trying to look out. Okay, and then I think we're ready to share your interview now.
In this episode, we'll be exploring the impacts of this digital addiction on our perception of relationships and sense of self-worth. Instagram, one of the most popular social media platforms, has introduced the concept of the followers to following ratio, where users may judge the quality of an Instagram account based on the number of followers and accounts followed. According to an article written on Buffer, a social media kit for small businesses, research has shown that social media time can cause a hormonal spike in oxytocin levels, causing them to rise as much as 13%. A research article titled The Positive Effect of Not Following Others on Social Media, written by Dr. Francesca Valsesia, highlights the effect of the number of accounts followed on social media users' engagement with content. They found that users following fewer accounts tend to receive more engagement in terms of likes and tweets. On the other hand, those following too many accounts are perceived as having less influence, and thus they receive less engagement. If we look more into the excessive use of social media and its association with harmful effects on mental health, we see that it particularly affects young people and their well being. Several testimonies, such as by neurologist Susan Greenfield, say that what social media delivers is experience, not thought. These fast paced images are driving how the brain is working. We're not thinking anymore, we're just reacting to things. We're faster at processing information, but not understanding it. Glamour magazine references research from 3M Corporation, which concluded that we react to an image 60,000 times faster than a word, and that when we are scrolling on Instagram, we are usually also jumping between other apps. The magazine indicates that multitasking between devices is common, meaning we're using what psychologists refer to as floodlight attention, which is when we are spreading our focus too thinly. Instead of spotlight attention, the kind of focus our brains thrive on. A quote from the article explains the detriment of practicing floodlight attention when consuming media or other information. They say, quote, consuming so much surface level information is causing a psychological phenomenon called information overload. And a 2019 study found this hugely impacts the motivational system of your brain. You literally perceive too much information as a threat and avoid it. Ironically, too much information means none of it is getting into our brains. Now, we'll be talking with Dr. Georgia Turner, a PhD student at the University of Cambridge. She studies the link between social media and mental health using mathematical models and approaches from neuroscience and psychology. Welcome to our podcast, Dr. Turner. Before we start, could you please state your name, pronouns, and tell us a little bit about yourself and how you became interested in studying social media and its connection to psychology?
Sure. Thank you so much for inviting me on the podcast. So I'm Georgia Turner. My pronouns are she, her. And so I came to kind of studying social media psychology from two angles. So my academic background was in psychology and neuroscience, and I really enjoyed kind of studying the mind, particularly using mathematical models. And then on the side from that, like everyone in my generation and every generation younger than me, I've always used social media since I was very young. And I also feel like I use it more than I would like to. So I really wanted to understand what it is about social media that makes me feel like I don't necessarily have control of my own use of it. And so, yeah, it's really social media psychology has allowed me to kind of unite both the academic interest and personal interest.
That sounds very cool. To start off our interview, what would you say are the main motivators of social media addiction?
So yeah, it's a really open question because a lot of the research at the moment kind of assumes that social media addiction is kind of a similar thing to drug addiction. And so they'll use a research kind of studies that very much modeled on drug addiction studies. And if you kind of search for something that looks like drug addiction, you will find that. So they're able to find people, for example, who seem to use social media who are prone to all kinds of addiction. But the question is that really the best way to define social media addiction, or what always seems like social media addiction? So it might be, for example, that what seems like social media addiction is actually someone who's just coping with something really difficult in their life. So they're escaping that by going on social media. Or it might be somebody else who's got, for example, an underlying condition like OCD, which causes them to kind of repetitively do things, but it's not that they're addicted specifically to social media. So I think we really need kind of a lot more research to understand if there are different kinds of social media, of what seems like social media addiction, and like whether there are to what extent in different cases some people are motivated by difficulties in their life, whereas others are motivated by what seems like the addictive features of a social media kind of app.
I found what you said about digital addiction and drug addiction being similar really interesting. Could you talk a little bit more about what those similarities might be?
So to be completely honest, I don't know if they are similar. I would just say that a lot of researchers assume that they are, but it's not necessarily the case that it is true. So kind of one possibility is that there could be kind of something that humans have and other animals that allows them to get addicted to certain things. But it could also be that we just haven't done enough research to really understand the differences. So I think it's quite difficult to say at this point, unfortunately.
No problem. It would probably be pretty difficult finding a direct correlation between the two, especially because they're different substances. But now that we've established the motivators, could you share how generational attitudes and behaviors shape social media addiction significance?
Yeah, definitely. So again, there's I'll probably stop having to say this to all of the questions because I would say there needs to be more research on this topic. But so one big thing I think is that a big generational difference is that while adults kind of often view social media as kind of like a toy that they or something that their children do, which they can kind of like TV, which you can limit the amount of time that they spend on it. But actually, they don't necessarily think about how social media is these days plays such a kind of deep role in young people's lives that it's not just something that you can kind of switch off, because it's where your friendships take place. It's where a lot of important conversations in your social life take place or events happen. And so kind of I think that's one kind of generational difference, is that while kind of parents see it as something that like a toy where we can cut off time, youth more likely to see it as kind of a portal into a big, really important part of their life, which can't just be kind of left or cut off that easily. And then another yeah, so that's one big difference. I would also say that it is difficult to contextualize it because I think every generation there's going to be something that youth use that adults aren't used to. So that happened with radio back in the day when that was first invented. It was a technology people were really scared of. Even with books, when books were first invented, people were saying that books are really addictive and they're really bad for you. So I think we also need to kind of think about the extent to which generational attitudes are always going to have these same conflicts which come up again and again, and it's not necessarily completely specific to social media.
I agree with what you said about how different generations put different meanings on up and coming technology. Today, with the outburst of social media apps within the past couple decades, we can see that sometimes adults themselves fall into the rabbit holes of social media and eventually become addicted, even though they did not grow up with this technology. Could you speak a little bit about this phenomenon and how it might affect the children of these adults?
That's a really, really interesting point. Yeah, because I was kind of talking about the children's social media use, but another big difference this kind of this generation has, which previous generations haven't has, is the ability for parents, for example, to post their children pictures of them growing up on their own social media. And I actually read an article recently that interviewed young children who aged 11 kind of grew up and found out that their parents had been posting on social media their whole time growing up. And if you kind of contrast that with other generations who at the age of 11, you're just beginning to think, who am I? What's my identity? What kind of identity do I want to present to the world? Then you've also got this kind of record already publicly available on the internet that you didn't create. I think that's going to be a very kind of new thing that this new generation of adolescents has to deal with. And of course, because it's so normalized, it means that uh, even it can even be difficult if your parent hasn't done that, because if it's really normal and then all of your friends can Google their name and find out that their parents have posted loads of pictures, but your parents haven't, that might also be something that people found difficult. So there's not kind of a simple solution to whether you should or shouldn't post that, but it's definitely a new thing that this generation has to deal with their parents' social media use.
That sounds really interesting. I haven't thought about it like that before. There are going to be so many differences between how children, even of a similar age group, are going to grow up. And sometimes their parents' use of social media can trademark their experience. Circling back to a broader idea of generational attitudes, I wanted to know if there are any differences in the perception and importance of social media across different age groups or demographics?
Uh, so yes, there are. And I think that's a really important thing which research is just moving into now, because previously research would kind of look at like what are the effects of social media use on everyone and not differentiate. But actually there are really important differences. So I could talk about two. The first one I'll talk about is age, as you've brought up. And so for age, I think social media kind of, we have lots of different changes that happen across our lifespan. And I think the way that social media affects you is often through the way that it taps into those changes that are happening anyway. So if you think about adolescence, that is a time when people are really particularly sensitive to social information, because maybe for evolutionary reasons, they're kind of getting ready to like leave their family and make new social connections. So they're really responsive to social information. And indeed, it's actually been found in a study by my supervisor, Dr. Amy Orban, that across the lifespan, adolescence is the time when the amount of social media you use predicts a most negative relationship with your mental health later. So it kind of does imply that adolescents might be particularly sensitive to social media use, and that could be partly because they're really already attuned to social information and they use it for all sorts of important things for their well-being, like thinking about their own self-worth. So that's age. And then with demographics, that's another thing which can also potentially affect the relationship between like how your social media use works. So gender is kind of one thing that there might also be gender differences. But one that's kind of interesting is actually differences between cisgender and transgender youth. And it's been found that in a couple of studies that while social media use can have a negative effect on cisgender adolescents' mental health, it can have a more positive effect on transgender adolescents' mental health. And again, it's not completely clear why this might be, but it could be because for some adolescents, it allows them to connect with people who aren't in their immediate social environment, who might have more in common with them and who they can explore their identity more in that way. Whereas other adolescents wouldn't feel that they needed that as much, so they wouldn't benefit from that aspect.
I found myself really relating to what you said about the age group demographics. When my sister, who's 2 years older than me, got a phone, I was also given a phone, and this was during my late years of middle school. I was so absorbed with this new technology, looking for all the features and customization options, and I would spend a lot of time messaging my friends. So, a lot of what goes on in social media can sort of connect with youth self perception. And I wanted to get into specific apps like Instagram, which uses connections to expand someone's social network. Can you explain what the followers to following ratio is on these platforms and why it is often considered significant in the digital space?
Yeah, so I think that's I can explain this as a researcher, but I'd also, yeah, I love to hear people's opinions who are adolescents right now. But so the followers following ratio is, yeah, the amount of people following you compared to the amount of people you are following. And it's publicly displayed on your profile so everyone can see it. And yeah, you can't exactly control it. It's what those people choose to do. So in terms of its significance in the digital space, I think that's a really interesting question, because so one thing that we do know about the way that people kind of think is that we're really primed to pay attention to markers of social status. And we really want to kind of look for hierarchies and look for ways to organize communities. But I would say that offline, or kind of like before the social media age, if you think about what kind of cues people could have used for that, they would have been a lot more abstract and ambiguous. It might be who's wearing cool clothes, who's eating lunch in a certain place, who's going to specific parties. But there's nothing kind of as public and unified as this ratio, which everyone has next to their name if you Google their name. So I think one thing that the ratio could be doing is kind of replacing those more ambiguous markers of social status with something that seems much more kind of public and permanent, and therefore it might be making social status seem a lot more important and a lot more difficult to change for adolescents. So I think that could be one of the kind of significance of this.
I wanted to build on top of what you said about popularity. How does this ratio affect the public's perception of who is popular and who's not? and how influential they are on social media?
Yeah, so I think that again is a really interesting question because I feel so yeah, I think it could be tempting, very tempting for a lot of people, even if they kind of they know that there's lots of things which will manipulate this ratio. It's not just about how popular you are, it's also about, you know, like how much time you spend on your account, how much effort you put into your posts. But I definitely think that even if people consciously realize that, there will be part of them that thinks I'll be more popular if I have a better ratio. And also I'll be seen to be more popular by other people, so it's something worth putting effort into trying to change. So yeah, I definitely think that that is something that could affect people's perceptions of who's popular, and people could start using that as kind of a rule to work out who's popular rather than kind of more complex or kind of nuanced things that they might have used before that.
I agree with your points. Something I noticed about not just the followers to following ratio, but in social media itself, is that in a geographic region, there are going to be people who you wouldn't expect to know each other, but you find out they actually follow each other on Instagram or social media. Oftentimes, it could just be a single meetup and social media exchange, but sometimes there are cases where people are closer than you originally thought, even though there's those physical barriers. And it's always surprising seeing this happen, especially because these individuals seemingly have no prior connection, like going to the same school or living in the same neighborhood. And it's that age range that really defines it.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I definitely think, yeah, like kind of this social media has given us ways to understand how our social networks look from a bird's eye view in a way that we would never have been able to before. And that's not entirely negative. Like that can be a nice way to kind of link people up or like make connections across regions that you wouldn't have been able to do, and that kind of thing. But I think it can also be difficult if it's something that people put more significance on than it should have. And also obviously it only means that if someone's following you, it doesn't it only means necessarily that they've met you once or sometimes not even met you. So I think it could also potentially lead people to draw conclusions which aren't necessarily true, and that again is partly because it's such a new kind of part of the social scene. It's not something that we've got lots of ways that we haven't, like, so with other kind of offline social stuff, like even to do with what clothes people wear, I think because that's been around so much longer as a signifier of potential popularity, we kind of have a lot more language to think about and talk about what that might mean. Whereas in a way, these social media features have sprung upon our communities so quickly that there isn't much kind of mutual understanding of what these means, which gives people a lot of time to spend ruminating on what it could mean. And it feels you're not allowed to ask people what it means, but actually it is an important thing to talk about. And so maybe, yeah, it would be good if we talked about it more, and that would kind of make it easier to kind of integrate into our view of the social world.
What would you say is the current preferred ratio? Do most people want a higher follower count?
To be honest, I actually don't know. I don't know if you know the answer to that?
From what I've seen, I found that a lot of people my age prefer having a higher follower count than following. I think a lot of people want to be like mini social media influencers, and that ratio is sort of trademarking how popular they are and what influence they have in the realm of digital media. Sometimes, and this happened to me a lot, but some people would follow your account to get a follow back, and once they get that reciprocated follow, they unfollow you.
That's really, really interesting. I think that almost that wasn't actually such a big thing. So when I was at high school, I'd say Facebook was the big social media, and we didn't have that. So with Facebook, you're just friends with someone, and they can't be you if you're friends with someone, they're also friends with you. So this whole kind of ratio thing wasn't really a thing. So that's really interesting to hear that that's like a difference between almost like our two generations. If I think as well about kind of the social significance of these different signifiers, I would also say that they kind of fluctuated across the years in popularity. So for example, if I look back to what I had when I was growing up, I think a big signifier of popularity would be if you get loads of posts for your birthday on Facebook, and people would be like counting how many people posted on their Facebook profile for their birthday, and that was kind of the equivalent of like a public thing which showed how popular you were. But as the years went on, it kind of started to take on a new meaning, which would be that, oh, maybe that person just used Facebook the whole time. That's like not very cool. And actually, what used to be a signifier of popularity became a signifier of like, oh, you're a loser, like you use that social media profile, you use your account too much or whatever like that. So I think it's really interesting to think about these generational differences, but I would also say that the significance of these specific things can also fluctuate in ways that, yeah, you wouldn't necessarily predict before.
Yeah, that's also a good point. And that kind of fluctuation can transcend apps themselves. We discussed Instagram and Facebook, but I also want to bring up another popular app, Snapchat. I'm not sure if you're familiar with all of the features on there, but one of the most defining elements is something called a snap score, which is basically a tally of how many snaps or photos you're sending out and receiving. I have a couple friends whose scores are basically 500,000 or even 1 million. And I'm always surprised seeing these numbers because it's crazy to think that all of this content is being sent back and forth. Those numbers are putting a label on it, where the higher your snap score, the more popular you are and the more time you're spending on these apps.
That's really interesting. Yeah. And that's again, that's something that didn't really, we did have Snapchat when I was younger, but we didn't have these kind of streaks and scores. And I have heard, I've actually read about, kind of interviews with younger people who talk about how that's difficult because that can bring a lot of social pressure. You're now not just pressured to talk to your friends at school, which our generations might have been, but you're pressured to be on your phone all the time in order to like convert your friendships into these scores. And I think these companies are of course doing that on purpose, to try and which kind of makes people feel like they need to spend more time using that product. But as you've kind of suggested, like it's not just how popular you are, it's how much time you spend on your phone that kind of affects that. So it's difficult. But I wonder if there would be ways, if we kind of spoke about this kind of thing more, to kind of allow people to reinterpret these numbers as not just signifying popularity and think of other ways. But that's really interesting. I didn't know that.
Right. I want to add on to what you said a little bit. What would you say is a good way to bring attention to this topic and really make it known that this is a problem and that we all have our experiences with it?
So I think you're doing a really great thing of like kind of making a podcast as one way to think about it. And honestly, maybe to just start talking about it with your friends, in a way that I think that, in terms of what's kind of socially acceptable to talk about, I feel like it's for some reason less socially acceptable to say to someone like, why didn't you like my photo, than to say like, why didn't you come to my party? Like it feels like social media is thought of as something that's too trivial, even though it can be really important. If you feel like your friend should have liked your photo, it can be important to understand why that they didn't, but it feels like it's not something that's okay to ask without seeming like you're kind of obsessed with social media. You might disagree, I'm not sure. That's how I feel in my social groups. So I guess one way would be to just begin being able to talk about these social media kind of interactions in the same way that we can talk about other kinds of interactions, and talk about like, what did it mean when you liked my photo, what did it mean when you unfollowed me, rather than just allowing all of those interactions to be something we can't talk about.
No, I definitely agree. There are some topics that are really awkward to bring up, especially when you're in person. And it kind of puts both parties in a sort of weird and vulnerable position. When I talk about social media with my friends, a lot of times they actually say they don't know why they use social media. And typically they say they don't bring up the topic of social media with other friends. I'd say that what happens on social media is usually kept in that digital space instead of brought out. So I wanted to connect this to social media's effect on interpersonal relationships. We recently had a discussion on how social media affects communication, but I wanted to know what your thoughts are on this.
About how it affects communication. So that's a really interesting question, because on the one hand it gives you loads of new ways to communicate, and that could seem great because you've got all of your normal ways to communicate, like seeing people, and then you've got all of these other things that you can do, other actions like sending them emojis or like sending them snaps. Sorry, I sound really old to not know, whatever, all the other stuff you have on social media. But the difficulty is that a lot of these new ways to communicate aren't things that we really understand or that we've talked about what they mean. So it can also give people ways of kind of conveying messages that they choose to make more difficult to interpret. Like if I'm annoyed with you and I don't want to confront you about it, maybe I'll just stop liking your pictures and stop replying to you. And you, therefore, as we've kind of talked about, it's harder for you to kind of like interpret that than if I did something rude to you in real life. So it can also kind of give people new ways to kind of obstruct communication and hide what they're really thinking. And that can be kind of a difficult thing, which we kind of need to talk about its impacts. So yeah, I think they've changed communication in many ways, but some of those actually, by giving more ways to communicate, have actually kind of made it more difficult to communicate sometimes. So yeah.
I like that you brought up that interpretation point. There are some aspects that you act online that's more passive aggressive and indirect than how you would respond in real life. I want to ask, what are some common assumptions, misconceptions, or judgments that are made based on social media use or that ratio that we talked about?
So what misconceptions might people make based on those follower kind of ratios? So yeah, I think that I think people probably conflate the amount of time or effort that you've put into your social media profile with how popular you are. And again, if we think about how this relates to previous markers of social status, like your clothing or other things that people might have looked at before, it would be the same thing. It would be, you know, if you dress really cool, people think you're really popular, but actually that might just mean that you have access to money to buy nice clothes. So that's kind of always been a problem with signifiers of social status, that they might not really mean what they seem to mean. But I think a difficulty with these social media follower ratios is that they're so public, and they're something you really don't have control of, and you really can't hide at all. And that means that although they might have the same problems as other signifiers of status, they're just more difficult to run away from, basically.
I agree with those points you mentioned. I want to zoom in on that ratio and ask, does a lower following count than followers correlate to more intimate or meaningful connections within a community? Or would you say it's mainly irrelevant when measuring the value of these relationships?
So yeah, that's a really good question. And in a way, it's something that we would have to check empirically by kind of doing research and asking people. But what I can tell you based on what the current evidence would be and what I think is that no, there will not be much of a relationship there in theory. So, or if there is, that relationship might differ for different people. So for some people, there might indeed be some people who have spent loads of time thinking only about their follower ratio, and therefore that they have let their personal relationships suffer as a result of that. But there will be other people who have like a good ratio, or whatever, not good, but you know, the right kind of ratio. But they've also put loads of effort into their friendships, and they still have meaningful connections. So I think it probably doesn't really tell us anything, even though in some people's cases it might be something that we should think about for them as a person.
Those are really great points. In my experience, Instagram would suggest me people to follow, and most of the time they're people from my school or people who are mutuals through someone I know. Sometimes I found that going through with those suggestions, following them, and just going on from there can end up in a sort of superficial relationship, since you don't truly get to know that person with the same experience you would if you had met in person. And rarely do I hang out with somebody in person that I met online. So that might say something about how Instagram suggestions can just result not benefiting either of you.
Yeah, definitely. But to be fair, I think it can also happen the other way. There are also some people that I know that, for example, I have found it easier to keep up with them and keep up with what's going on in their life because I follow them. So I see their stories, and I might message them and say like a small message, and that gives you a way to kind of keep in touch with people that you wouldn't have kept in touch with. So I think it can give a superficial relationship, but there are also some cases where it can give a really positive relationship as well. And so it's difficult to kind of generalize it, I think. I wonder if I'm just thinking this just now, but I wonder if, so for me, a lot of the friends that I find it easier to keep up with are people that are, for example, don't live in another country and that kind of thing you wouldn't see otherwise. Whereas if it's somebody at your school, maybe the kind of school environment means that Instagram, the following people doesn't really help there, but it helps people that you wouldn't otherwise see in your real life at school. I don't know.
I like that you pointed that out. Environments in which you socialize probably do play a part in the effectiveness of that suggesting tool. And I agree with what you said about that usefulness. It didn't pop into my head that it can help grow that relationship, especially when there's someone who you wouldn't typically reach out to. So I wanted to pivot back to that idea of followers. Could you discuss the phenomena of follower chasing or the pursuit of gaining followers for validation or social status?
Yeah, so this so I guess this kind of relates to the conversations we've had so far about people substituting something that they care about, so they care about social status, and then substituting that for something else which is easier to kind of think about and simpler, which is like chasing followers and getting more followers. So instead of doing the difficult task of really working on my friendships, thinking about how I could be a better person so people like me, or thinking about what people need in a complex way, it's much easier to just have this number and kind of hack it in various more simple seeming ways. So that kind of substitution is something that kind of humans do all the time. We look for simple ways to get around complex tasks. And it's not kind of specific to like that as a process isn't specific to follower chasing. But I do think that it's possible that by bringing it into this domain of your social relationships, and kind of giving people this shortcut to feeling popular, could be kind of preventing them from making more complex efforts to kind of confront difficult problems, or kind of confront difficult social problems, or improve themselves, or learn in more complex ways about the social world. And so it could be having kind of mental health effects in the ways that it might distract people from other ways to improve their social standing or whatever.
Were there any instances where you or someone you knew prioritized that ratio and online connections and getting caught up in that digital presence over in person relationships and current events?
Yeah, I definitely think that's happened quite a few times to me and people I know. Yeah, definitely. I'm sure it's happened to more people than it hasn't happened to. If I think about my own personal relationship with social media, I would say that it's not exactly about the follower ratio, but when I've kind of got in a habit of posting loads of photos on social media of what I do, I have found that I started thinking that kind of social events wouldn't count unless they looked good on social media. So I would take photos of nice things and put them on social media, but then whenever I'd be doing something nice, I'd think I have to take a photo and put it on social media. And eventually I dealt with that by just stopping putting any photos on social media at all, because for me, although it's nice to share my memories with friends and I really like that, I found that the way that it affected the way that I experienced my real life was not something that I was happy with. So I chose not to do it in the end. So for me, yeah, that wasn't the ratio though. But I definitely think I know people, I think this happens fairly often, that people will get very into the follower ratio, and especially when it's going well and it's like, great, the more I do this, the more I get more followers, and that makes me happy, and that's really good. But then often that will plateau, or it will go out of control, and you'll stop understanding what's causing those. So I know someone who was kind of doing that and they became an influencer, but then they realized that actually they started losing followers and they didn't know why, and they didn't understand it in the same way that you might understand other social processes that happen. And that was really difficult, and then they kind of stopped posting as well. So yeah, I think these things, they can kind of be nice when it's going well, because it's very easy to learn a rule about followers, like this is all you have to do to game them. But the trouble with it is that it's not always going to work, and then it's difficult to understand why it's not working.
I wanted to just jump in and share an anecdotal experience. I used to hang out with some foodies, and there were moments where like the food's on the table, but they wouldn't let me touch my food until they took the perfect picture. And I remember at one point it started getting really annoying, and I just stopped like participating in the food picture process. But I also don't post anymore on social media because I just found myself, once I post, I'm like looking back how many people liked it, how many people liked it, and that just like sucks all the fun out of the present moment.
Exactly, yeah. So I think in theory it would be nice, like the idea that you can share what you do with your friends is really nice, but in practice it can affect the way that you experience your real life in ways that are really not worth it.
I really like that you highlighted that experience where you felt the need to post online on social media of your experiences. That's definitely something that I went through, but less on a social media note, but more of the idea that experiences won't count unless they're documented. But generally, I find this really interesting that all of this is sort of a shared experience. Going back to when I first got my phone, I was honestly basically addicted to it. I'd spend hours on call with friends, even though I'd see them the next day at school. And I'd spend a lot of time scrolling on Instagram and looking for more content. Talking about this sort of mindset of social media presence, though, how does putting so much importance on digital presence affect the dynamics of relationships and interactions on social media?
So I think one thing that can happen is that people there could be a lot of misunderstandings that happen because people put significance into things that other people didn't necessarily mean to be significant. So for example, we, like many social media sites, tell you when people have been online, when they've read messages and that kind of thing. And it's very kind of easy to take that as an indicator of a message, something that someone's trying to send you. Like if they read your mess, if they went online and didn't read your message, that's because they're trying to send you a message that they don't care about what you said or something. Whereas actually they might have just clicked on their phone to do something else, and you have no idea what's happening in their life. And this experience is quite new in the social media age, because previously you would know what someone was doing when you were interacting with them, and you would know that if they are not replying to you or not listening to you, it's on purpose. But we've kind of brought that assumption into the social media age where that's not always true anymore. And so I think we can think things that are significant when they actually weren't significant. And it can cause kind of a lot of rumination or misunderstanding between people, which can be difficult.
I agree. I think that the anonymity of social media is one of the most useful tools for me. I find it easier to turn off read receipts so I'm not silently rushed or pressured to respond to a message just because I'm online. I felt that the action of sending a response itself was one of the most important parts of that interaction, whether it was genuine or not.
Yeah, and you've also kind of mentioned something that's really important there as well, which is the fact that we don't, like, social media doesn't have to be the way it is right now. Like like there's many ways that firstly the companies could bring in new features to make these things different, but also we as users can also take control of what features we turn on and off, rather than just letting social media kind of control us. And I actually think that's a big difference, what I've seen so far, between already my generation and your generation. Because I think my generation, we were kind of the first generation to use social media. We never really thought about the fact that we could take control of which features we used. So, for example, all of our Facebook accounts, which is our old accounts from when we were young, they've still got all the photos that we have of us, that of me like being stupid when I was really young and like that kind of thing. And I just never really thought to kind of recurate that. Whereas I think it's, tell me if I'm wrong, I think it's a lot more common for young people now to kind of archive the pictures that they don't feel represent them anymore and really actively curate their profile. to make sure that it still aligns with what they want it to say, rather than just letting social media dictate how they're presented. So that's like a positive thing that can happen as well.
I definitely agree with what you said. Sometimes my friends would post things that they didn't actively want to post, but they just felt like they were behind in posts and updates and felt like they had to in order to stay relevant. And that brings me to another topic about the features of Instagram. One of the features I really wish they had was the ability to mark a notification as read just from the notification bar, instead of having it sit there and being forced to open the app to have it marked as read. Because I would open the app with the original intent to clear that notification, but sometimes I get distracted by my feed and spend more time on the app than I originally wanted to.
Yeah, and it's cool. It's interesting seeing how like these small features can kind of really change the whole social life and behaviors,
Mhm.
and think about ways that we can kind of stop having to depend so much on like what certain companies decide to put in their products.
Yeah, finally, I recently came across your statement on an article called How to Stop the Mindless Scrolling on Business Insider, and they talked about an app called OneSec. The page stated that downloaders who used the app for 6 weeks reduced other app usage by around 57%. And you said that the constantly changing prompts are a key contributor to the app's effectiveness on users. Can you talk a little bit about what the app is and the psychology and techniques behind its effectiveness?
Sure. So yeah, I would quickly begin by saying that the kind of study that showed that the app reduced usage wasn't necessarily the most rigorous kind of study that you could have done. So they looked at how people who started using the app later reduced their usage, but they didn't kind of adjust for the fact that those people were more likely, because they just downloaded the app, to be the kind of people who were going to reduce their usage anyway. So it definitely needs to kind of have a bit more rigorous research to look at just how effective this app really is if you test it really carefully. However, the theory of the app does make sense, and it's quite an interesting concept. So the way that OneSec app works is that when you open your app that you feel that you want to use less, and you would have told that what it is, for example, Instagram, it will tell you to do an exercise like doing a breathing exercise or doing some kind of action before you go back into Instagram. And what this is kind of getting at is when we form habits, we can kind of start forming automatic chains of events where having one experience, like seeing your phone, cues another experience automatically, like clicking on your Instagram app, because you're like kind of not really paying attention and it's just kicking in a habit. In the same way that when you walk into your kitchen, you might automatically go and, because you're in the kitchen, open the fridge door, even if that's not actually what you intended to do. So the aim of the app is to kind of disrupt these automatic chains and to make you basically say, wake up, like, don't just follow this automatic process. Think consciously about whether you want to do that next. And if you do want to, then fine, you can do it, but don't just do it because it's an automatic thing to do. And the reason why I said it was important, if you're going to do that for the app to change what it does, is because if the app's always telling you to do the same thing, then that can just become part of the automatic process. So there are some apps which do that. I know that there's some apps that tell you like, you've been on Instagram for too long today, don't go on it, and you have to click to go on it. But when there's those apps, it's people just kind of integrate that into their habitual chain of events. So like you open your Instagram app, get rid of that notification, and then go on Instagram, and that just becomes an automatic thing. Whereas if you make that intervention change each time it happens, then it's more likely that it will really not get integrated into the habit and really disrupt it each time.
I found what you said about the target audience of that app to be really interesting. It is typically people who want to lower their screen time who download apps like OneSec. I was also curious about what you said about that automatic process and entering an app. They're kind of breaking that cycle of just repetitive pop ups and notifications. Could you talk about those features of OneSec that prevent people from entering those apps?
So yeah, I think it's really just about kind of disrupt. It's basically like saying to people, wake up, like do this breathing exercise, think about what you're doing, and getting people to more consciously reflect on what they're doing. And as we've said, as you brought up, these are people who already wanted to stop using that app. So when you tell them to wake up and realize what you're doing, they'll be like, oh yeah, I'm doing this thing I didn't want to do, so I'll stop it. Whereas it would kind of remain to be questioned how much that would work. It kind of relies on the fact that the person already has a certain amount of willingness to really control their usage. So it would be interesting and kind of another question to understand how that would work for people who hadn't actively already decided to get involved with this process.
I definitely agree with that. So, reflecting on features of these media apps, do you have thoughts on these good and bad aspects, and maybe some that don't exist yet, that tech companies do or could do to create a healthier relationship with social media and technology?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. Let me think. I think anything that kind of gives people back a bit more of the agency that they had would be good. So if people have more agency to hide, for example, their following follower ratio, or to hide their read receipts, or to read their messages without someone else knowing, or that kind of thing. So to opt in and opt out of certain of these features. I don't think that would go all the way, because there would still be social pressure to engage in certain things. But I think that would be one thing that you feel that you can escape, because you can imagine. Yeah, so I think giving people kind of more choices to curate their own social media experience might be a good one. I also think, yeah, particularly when it kind of comes to hiding what they've done on their phone from other people, that you don't want people to know that you've always been online, or that kind of thing. I also think that these quantifiable kind of aspect, kind of quantifying friendships, for example, in snap scores or snap streaks, or amounts of likes, I think that's not necessarily good for people, because yeah, it really kind of makes them kind of convert their friendship or social connections, which they really care about, into these quantifiable things. So I think moving away from that might be something that would be a good thing.
Those are some really great points. As we wrap up, do you have any tips for adults who either raise children or work with children to establish a healthier sense of belonging and acceptance among youth when it comes to the popularity contest of followers and following?
Yeah, so the first tip, yeah, would be basically to take it seriously. So to take seriously the fact that people are upset about this kind of thing, rather than just thinking like that it's kind of a shallow popularity concern, and to really understand why people find this important and get upset about it, and then to talk to them about it. So not to make social media kind of the remit of like the young people and their friends that they can't talk to their parents about, because I think often it's kind of, it comes in whole languages and that kind of thing that parents don't even understand. So another thing I would say is to just really ask your child to explain to you what these things mean to them, and then try and think about how they relate to stuff that you might have had growing up, which might have not. So for example, they're concerned about follower ratio. You didn't have that when you were younger, but what did you have when you were younger that was similar to that? Like maybe you were concerned about a different signifier of popularity, and how did that make you feel? And try and make those connections between like things on social media and things off social media, to try and understand and relate to them, and be able to provide them with advice, because a lot of these experiences on social media are not as new as they seem. Like it's not just something about social media that we've never seen before. It's tapping into like age-old experiences and ways that social life works, which people can relate to. And it's really important to try and bridge that gap between parents and children, rather than children feeling like parents can't understand their social media life.
Awesome, thank you. I had another follow up question. When talking about these youths who are present on social media, what would you say is an age that is appropriate to have or be exposed to social media? Because when going to the App Store and downloading apps like Instagram and Snapchat, it says that you have to be at least 13 to have them. But currently, there are kids in primary school who have personal devices and already have so many social media apps.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question. I think it's difficult to know without kind of, yeah, like I don't have like a particular research that I'm referring to which would say that. I would say that it's difficult to make blanket bans, because if that's a way that people kind of socialize, then that is something that we shouldn't necessarily try and stop. But I think it's something that we should try and, yeah, to be honest, I'm not sure what age. I think, I don't know, I'm open to the fact that it could be not necessarily a bad thing for young people, just because we're not used to it and we're very scared to give people this thing. And I think we should maybe be asking, how can we make, at whatever age someone is using it, how can we make that use the most healthy way that it can be? Like, how can we make sure that they're using it in a safe way that makes them feel good, rather than saying should they be using it or not? Because I think at all ages it can be harmful as well, including at older ages. And we wouldn't say that, I mean, it might even be potentially more harmful at older teenage years than it is for younger years, because those are kind of, those adolescent years are the years where you much more rely on social information for your self-worth and your self-esteem and that kind of thing. So I think it might not be more dangerous younger than that, but I think we should be asking how we can kind of best protect people at all ages who are using it.
Definitely, being digitally safe and informed is a priority, especially when pertaining to youth and adolescents who are still growing up with technology, getting used to all of the information coming in, forming opinions, and integrating themselves into society.
Yeah, definitely.
So, this has been a really insightful conversation. Was there anything that we did not cover that you'd like to address?
No, not right now. Thank you so much. I thought that questions were really interesting, and it was particularly interesting to kind of compare our two different generations. And I learned a lot as well by talking to you about how you and your friends use social media and how it might differ from how I did. So it's cool.
All right, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciated your insights.
Great, thank you so much. It was lovely to meet you.
Hi, I'm Rashmi, and I'll be leading you through a gentle self-massage practice today. So let's go ahead and get started by finding a comfortable posture. This can be seated or laying down, maybe even standing up. Go ahead and start to settle into your posture of choice. Taking a nice deep inhale through the nose, exhaling out of the nose or mouth, connecting with your breath and your body. And as you're ready, gently bringing one hand to your heart and one hand to your belly. Taking a nice deep inhale through the nose and exhaling out of the nose. As you're ready, bringing your fingertips to the top of your head and in a circular motion, starting to massage the top of your head and your scalp. Massaging all over the head, maybe bringing the fingertips to the forehead, massaging the forehead and the temples, Massaging around the eyes. Maybe taking a deep breath here and thanking your eyes for all that they do. Thanking your nose as you massage it, and your cheeks. Thanking your lips and teeth. And massaging the jaw as well. Maybe taking a couple extra moments at the jaw. Some of us tend to hold a lot of tension in the jaw, so just paying some extra attention and care to this area of our face. And as you're ready, moving down to the nape of the neck, and the back of the neck and collarbone. Taking a nice deep inhale through the nose, exhaling out of the nose. Feel free to come back to this practice at any point throughout your day. Thank you so much for joining me.